Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, as Mr Ferguson indicated, we will be proposing a further amendment to the sessional orders over and above what is presented to us here today. And it is galling to have the Leader of Government Business tell us that we should be grateful for being called what we are, which is Greens members in this place. And the other members clause in the sessional orders was put in there in 2014 to other us, to make us an other in this place, and to deny the fact that we are a political party with a strong and growing membership, which of course in a time of climate emergency is going to continue to grow, Mr Deputy, Madam Speaker. So yes, we support the change that rightfully describes Dr Woodruff and I and any Green member who comes into this place after us as Greens members. Yes, we agree that the new independent member for Clark, Ms Ogilvie, and welcome Ms Ogilvie, is entitled to a question each question time. But hanging this threat over our heads of taking a question away from us is cheap. And it's nasty.
But we haven't,
Madam Speaker.
It's not a threat.
No, but it was a persistent threat during these negotiations. And the fact of the matter is, we have to endure in this place each day 4 Dorothy Dix questions, Madam Speaker, from a government that has only 3 backbenchers, and only one of them is actually solely dedicated to the backbench. Well, in fact, none of them are, when I think on it.
You had 6.
Because we have Mr Tucker, and Ms Petrusma and Mrs Ryler on the backbench of government, and yet the government awards themselves 4 Dorothy Dix questions, and we're supposed to be grateful
down from 6
for our 2. So, Madam Speaker.
It's a funny way to say you agree.
Well, it just galls me that we're supposed to be grateful for just having our rights in this place.
You said you were grateful.
To ask you questions and knowing, unfortunately, that we very rarely get answers. So, Madam Speaker, we move that the motion be amended by inserting after clause 2 the following new clause 3. The following new sessional order is inserted after sessional order 48A, 48B. Maximum time for questions and answers. Notwithstanding the provisions of Standing Order 48, the Speaker shall ensure the time taken to ask a question does not exceed 1 minute and the time taken to answer a question does not exceed 4 minutes. Now, Madam Speaker, in the last sitting, Mr Gutman, the Treasurer, in response to a question that went something like, can the Treasurer tell us what a great job he's doing of pretending that we're in a golden age, and is he aware of any other alternatives? And the answer to that Dorothy Dix question ran at 7.5 minutes, Madam Speaker. So we had a Dorothy Dix question today to the Minister for Primary Industries and Water that ran for 4.5 minutes. Minister Archer got up on a Dorothy Dix question today and spoke for 6.5 minutes. And Mr Gutman again today, in response to another question to ask him to tell us how terrific he is, spoke for 5 minutes and 20 seconds. Now, Madam Speaker, so in each question time, 4 Dorothy Dix questions, none of them are less than 4 minutes, and many of them nudge 6.5, 7 minutes. That's somewhere between 20 and 25 minutes of every taxpayer-funded question time being devoted to the government telling itself how terrific it is. That's not the purpose of question time, Madam Speaker. That is not the purpose. Question time is an important principle of the Westminster system. It is there for transparency and accountability, and that is why we are moving this amendment. And, Madam Speaker, I spent last week in Canberra for a series of meetings, and I went into Senate question time during the sitting. Apart from the depressing spectacle of watching the two major parties in that place denigrate Greens' questions about the need for climate action, the need to respond to young people who are distressed about the climate, the need to take action to protect the reef. The appalling and depressing spectacle of Labor and Liberal members groaning or turning to their phones when the Greens got up to ask this question again and again. Apart from that depressing spectacle, Madam Speaker, what we see in the Senate is an appropriate framework for making sure that questions are tight, contained, and they are 1 minute long. And the answers are 2 minutes long, Madam Speaker. And the clock runs, and you can see the clock in the Senate. It ticks down. And as soon as that 1 minute's up, the mic goes off, Madam Speaker. As soon as the 2 minutes up on the minister's answer, the mic goes off. Or the President shuts down the minister, and then, of course, they allow for 2 supplementary questions, which have to be asked within 30 seconds from memory, and the minister then has another minute to answer those supplementary questions. Madam Speaker, it's a much more dynamic approach to question time. It is much more in the spirit of what question time should be about, Madam Speaker. Now, in saying this and in moving this amendment, Madam Speaker, I note that you, Madam Speaker, do have the authority and the power to sit down ministers when they've talked for too long. You do, Madam Speaker.
And it happens.
I simply make that comment and observation, Madam Speaker, and I do hope that we do see more of that. Why do you scoff?
It happens already.
Through the chair, please. Through the chair.
Well, the 7.5-minute Dorothy Dix answer to another inane, self-congratulatory question from the government to itself demonstrated that there is a problem in this place with government members and ministers having respect for the Westminster tradition of question time and for the public's right to know, and the fact that we're all here on the public purse, Madam Speaker. And this is not about, us wanting more questions so that ministers, us wanting ministers to talk for a shorter amount of time so that we have more questions, although that would be excellent, Madam Speaker. It's that question time is about questions and answers. It is not about self-congratulation. The government has many tools at its disposal to tell itself and any Tasmanian who's bored enough to listen how terrific it is. It can have a ministerial statement. It could, for example, for the more trite Dorothy Dixes that we get in this place, issue a media release. Madam Speaker, it could step outside, call a press conference and wave its arms around. Any minister can do that and will probably get covered, Madam Speaker. But no, in this little place where we have this precious allocation of questions, what we get every single question time is these banal, insulting questions from the government to itself, and then abuse of the forms of this House to answer, in inverted commas, questions at great length. And for the purposes of Hansard, Madam Speaker, it is important to also note that often those answers are scripted answers that have been prepared either by the department or in the minister's office. And then when the minister reads through the scripted answer, almost without exception, what we get is the flip on a dime and an attack on the other side of the House, and it devolves into politics. So at least half of the Dorothy Dix answers that we get in this place are spent attacking the other side of the House, reaching into the recesses of history, Madam Speaker, to accuse members on the other side of all manner of heinous acts while in government, Madam Speaker. So we strongly believe that there should be time limits on questions, whether they be Dorothy Dix questions or questions that have been asked by opposition or crossbench members, Madam Speaker. If you cannot tell a story and answer a question in a complete fashion in under 4 minutes, you've got a communication problem, Madam Speaker. So much of what we read in the Greens here each day when I go through the uncorrected proofs is tedious repetition. It is waffle. It is inane, insulting and highly political, and there shouldn't be a place for it in question time. Madam Speaker, it's a lack of respect for the Westminster system and question time and the public's right to know that leads to 4 Dorothy Dix questions and these bloated, self-congratulatory, inane political answers every day that consume about a third of our question time, Madam Speaker. So my understanding is that neither the government, of course, won't, because it likes to take up as much of the question time allocation talking about itself in response to its own questions so it doesn't have to face scrutiny. But we also understand that Labor won't be supporting our amendment because, of course, Labor's got an eye on that day in the how far distant future, I don't know, when it'll be back in government again, and it wants the capacity to ask itself questions and spend half of the Dorothy Dix answers attacking the other side of the House. Yeah. And I think just in terms of public perception, the sniff test, the way question time is conducted here with this government is insulting to the public. Most members of the public, should they know that the government asks itself 4 questions each question time and then spends a third of question time talking about how terrific it is in response to its own questions, most Tasmanians would find that offensive and a waste of time. It does fail the sniff test. And I think what's happening here, Madam Speaker, is that government members rely on the fact that most people don't watch question time because they're too sane to do that, of course, Madam Speaker. But if they did, they'd be revolted. I believe they'd be revolted by what they see coming out of the government side of this House each and every day, because it insults them, it insults their intelligence, and it insults the Westminster system. Madam Speaker, I commend the amendment to the House.
Thank you. Could I just ask Ms O'Connor if she could provide that copy of the amendment to the clerk and myself? Thank you. Yes, please. We'll have Mr
Madam
O'Byrne.
Speaker, on the amendment and the amendment, I will deal with the Greens amendment. Secondly, firstly, if I can deal with the government's amendment, we received the proposal this morning, and we acknowledge the attempts by the government to ensure that the existing rights and existing access to MPIs and matters before the House, and also questions and question time, and the commitment that was given upon the election of Ms Ogilvie to the seat of clerk in the recount have been honoured in terms of the content of the amendment that you propose, and we believe it is appropriate that members, regardless of their position in this House, have an opportunity to ask questions on behalf of their constituents, and at a reasonable amount of time is allocated to ensure that they are able to debate a matter of public importance. And we think the amendment from the government that has been supported by the Greens in those respects has been honoured, and we would indicate our support for those. It is important that members' voices have they're heard. But in terms of the content and the contribution by Ms O'Connor and her amendment, and we have absolute sympathy with the issues that she raised, and I think the conduct of question time should be of intense interest to the people of the community, and it's vitally important that it works for all people, Madam Speaker, that clear questions that opposition members have of the government are able to be asked, and the government are in a position to answer those. And I echo the member for Clark's frustrations with the current conduct of question time. I mean, she indicated a little bit of a backhander as she was sitting down that both the major parties are not interested in supporting the amendment, therefore we're against reform, and that is plainly not true and unfair, because the amendment actually that is put forward by the Greens doesn't deal with the issue of Dorothy Dix questions. It doesn't deal with it at all. It just deals with time limits, and it could be 10 seconds or 10 minutes. But the drivel that we got in another example today from the government, effectively you could answer in 10 seconds, and the answer is we don't take responsibility and it's Labor's fault. That could be said in 10 minutes or 10 seconds. Time limits does not deal with the conduct of certain ministers giving answers, and it certainly does not deal with what we've seen. And I think, and I do agree with the member for Clark on this, some of the more extreme abuse of the Westminster system in terms of the role of Dorothy Dix questions and answers and the conduct of the government. So I think the point is well made that those Dorothy Dix questions and the conduct of this government is an extreme level in terms of
abuse,
the gratuitous nature of them. And I think it is incumbent on all of us to acknowledge that we need to ensure that we conduct ourselves in this House, particularly at question time, in a way that benefits the community. Now that doesn't, and there's no doubt that passions run high in question time. That should not be in question. We are very passionate about the issues we raise in this House, but the issue of Dorothy Dix is one that does fundamentally undermine at times the conduct of this House, and I know other houses and other Westminster houses, both in this country and across the globe, are looking at the issue of Dorothy Dix questions and answers. And I think we should also have an eye on how they seek to reform their questions and how they seek to deal with matters of public importance. And the issue of question time, it's the one time in the day in a 3-day sitting week where we are able to put on the record and ask questions that are front and centre in the interests of the community. Now, the reasons why we're not supporting the Greens amendment is not because we don't think that time limits are important. We think they are, but we need to understand that when you compare, for example, as the member did, compare us to the Senate, the nature and the conduct of the Senate question time and federal Parliament question time is very different to that of the Tasmanian House and the traditions that we have followed. There are very different rules.
Why should it be so different?
There are.
But why should it be?
Well, that's not the question that's put before the House. You're bringing in time. What I'm saying is, if you can let me finish, what I'm saying is that they conduct themselves very differently. There is a very different approach to the conduct of members asking questions and what they can and how they can ask questions. For example, preamble, argument, and a whole range of standing orders that are sort of semi-reflected in Tasmanian, in the Tasmanian Parliament standing orders, which give those members the ability in that federal House to ask very clear and concise questions, and also the use of supplementary questions and standing orders around supplementary questions do give the opportunity to have that debate and discussion on an issue, and that is not necessarily a feature of this House. And when I was a minister in government, at times when I was asked very serious questions, and I was answering those questions to the best of my ability, at times I would need to take over 4 minutes because they were of importance. So I think hard and fast time limit rules without a series of other standing orders which allow supplementary and other forms of the House. Now, we have a tradition in this House that scope is given to the question, and scope is given to the person answering the question, the Minister of the day or a member of government to be able to answer within reason. Now I know that the Speaker has at times made references to the current standing orders and her ability to facilitate the good manner and the good order of the House. And I have absolute sympathy with the Speaker. I think these are issues that may very well need to be discussed by the Standing Orders Committee, and we should,
regrettably,
as
the
a
Greens
Parliament,
aren't on, so you'll just stitch it up between yourselves as ever.
We should have a discussion about how we can improve, because I know if there is a view that the current standing orders do not provide the Speaker with the ability to bring the Minister or a member of government to answer the question, or that they are going on at times a bit too long, within reason. We think that there are standing orders that may be able to be referred to or addressed that can assist the Speaker in her deliberations. And I know at a time I have been brought to the attention of the content of the question and to the time. So I think it may be that the issues you raise, Ms O'Connor, are genuine, but I don't think the amendment doesn't resolve it because the example you use in terms of the Australian Senate have a different set of standing orders, particularly as it relates to
answer a question in 4 minutes.
I don't disagree with you.
Their ministers can answer.
I don't disagree with you about the conduct of this government and how they answer questions. What I am disagreeing with you about the mechanism about how we address that. And I think this House should be mature enough to be able to engage in a conversation, maybe at the Standing Orders Committee, where we can assist the Speaker and assist the members in the House to ensure that we are doing the best by the people of Tasmania. And again, I make the point that the display of this government since I have returned to this House after the last election is nothing short of disgraceful. Their Dorothy Dixes are extreme. They are, in my view, a perversion of the Westminster system. They have taken it to, as they like to say, Madam Speaker, the next level.
They make no apologies.
They make no apologies, and it's offensive to the Tasmanian community. And because for those people that do take an interest in Tasmanian politics and do see question time, they do shake their head at the performance of the government. And all I would do, the prime example today that we saw in serious answers about public safety. Imagine the people from Risdon Vale and Gilston Bay today watching the response from their government and their local member, the Premier, Will Hodgman, in failing to answer question after question after question about people's public safety, when all he would do was refuse to take responsibility for what is happening under his watch. Now we're into the 6th year of his premiership. Refused to take responsibility, and from day one, from second one, he would get up and blame Labor. And we saw a Dorothy Dix on the matter relating to domestic and family violence. And this is an issue that we have offered bipartisan and shown bipartisan support. And the two cheap political points that the Premier made on his feet on an issue, on a Dorothy Dix, on an issue of such a seriousness of domestic and family violence, he went straight to the politics, straight to the Labor Green slur.
There's been tripartisanship on this issue.
And then, despite the fact that we've offered bipartisanship nature and have genuine bipartisanship on this issue, he played that old Liberal tactic of saying, am I aware of any other policies? And again, Labor stand for nothing, Labor do nothing. Well, if you offer the hand of bipartisanship and we accept it and take it, and then in question time you politicise this issue and slap us in the face for this bipartisanship, those people watching, those victims of family and domestic violence, those people who have a strong and caring interest in the safety of people in our community, for the government to get up and make such a cheap, base political point is the reason why frustrations are bubbling up in terms of the accountability of the government, in terms of the accountability of each minister. And we don't, and the fish rots from the head, Madam Speaker, and we don't only see it in this House, we see it in the estimates committees. We saw the Treasurer in the previous Estimates Committee being asked serious questions about the conduct and the manner in which he manages the budget and his strategy moving forward. He just, and a whole range of matters, he just would refuse to answer them. So accountability, transparency and responsibility to the forms of the House are something that we hold dear, that we think are important. And the reasons why frustrations are bubbling over and the reasons why people are losing faith is because those forms, those standing orders and the principles of the Westminster system are not being honoured, And so whilst we accept that the motion, the amendment to the standing orders by the government are consistent with the discussions that we've had, the amendment by the member for Clark, Ms O'Connor, whilst the argument around the amendment is well made. The amendment doesn't resolve those issues. We do believe ministers should be given a level of latitude to answer the question, and if there is an issue with the standing orders in terms of relevance and time, and if the Speaker is of the view that the Speaker is not able to bring those two issues to bear, then we need to have a discussion in the Standing Orders Committee, and we would support a mature debate across both sides of this House about how we can do that, because it's not just about Labor or Liberal or Green. It is about this Parliament functioning in a way that has the faith of the Tasmanian community. So we support the amendment from the government that gives the independent member, Ms Ogilvie, member for Clark, the ability to ask a question on behalf of her constituents and the ability to raise a matter of public importance at a reasonable routine or occurrence or timing. We do not support the amendment because it will not resolve the issues raised in the argument supporting it. Thank you.
So you didn't have an amendment then? No amendment. No. Okay, thank you. Leader of the House.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. I'll just rise to briefly address the amendment that's been put before the House by Ms O'Connor and just indicate that the government doesn't support her amendment. I'd like to share a few reasons why, and I'll keep it brief, because once again, this debate has already changed from something that should have been very straightforward and procedural to accommodate the new member.
If you think you own this place.
We did not need to spend all this time talking about ourselves when we ought to be getting on to the business of the day, including the important justice legislation. So, Madam Speaker, I think it would be worth me pointing out that Ms O'Connor in her address made the claim that a minister that couldn't answer a question in 4 minutes has got a communication problem. Well,
here we go.
Madam Speaker, in the time that it took for Ms O'Connor to sit down, it didn't take my office very long to find a 7-minute Dorothy Dix from the Greens to none other than the Minister Cassy O'Connor, as recently as the last year of the previous government, the last year. And it was a time where just a quick cursory look through it...
Was I talking about climate change by any chance?
It's exactly what it was about. It's almost like a Dorothy Dixon just now. Funny how you asked the question, you already knew the answer.
Look where we could be today.
It's like you already knew the answer. And through you, Madam Speaker, the then Minister, Ms O'Connor, spent precisely 7 minutes attacking the Prime Minister Tony Abbott at the time.
We should have gone.
And it reads like a grade 10 essay. It's clearly either one of the more coherent pieces of impromptu work from Ms O'Connor or a prepared script. One or the other. I must say it reads like a well-prepared piece of writing.
I answered most of my questions.
By the way, Madam Speaker, that the Speaker of the day pointed out to Ms O'Connor that it's common practice to refer to state premiers and others by their proper title, and I believe it would have been Mr Polly who asked you and other members to do this as a courtesy, regardless of the holder of the office. It's the Prime Minister of Australia that Speaker Polly chided you about. But the point there is that, it suited you when you were in government to be able to make some statements on behalf of your government that you felt at the time were important to ask. And who could forget... I'll ask the question. Let's see if you can remember who asked you the question.
Basil.
Of course you know the answer to that question, because Basil asked you questions all the time.
No, he didn't.
In fact, to the point that there's the most famous quote that when Mr O'Halloran asked you a question, your first phraseology when you answered him was, "Oh, Basil, you're such a cutie." Now, I mean, one of the most... Oh, Basil, you're such a cutie.
No, that's not what I said.
I hope that one day the Uni Review finds a way to weave that into one of their performances. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, look, Mr O'Byrne has, I think, I'll lay aside his claims about, which I dispute, claims that the government doesn't treat the House and question time with the proper respect.
It doesn't.
We do, but I do agree with Mr O'Byrne's general statements that, members of this House need to remember, and any of those of us who have been around for more than 1 or 2 terms will be able to say, the fact is that the political parties inevitably take their turns about between government and opposition as the will of the people dictates. Now, the fact is that it's important. It's more important I say, for the opposition of the day to be able to ask questions that are a scrutiny of the executive government. That is proper, but it is also a 400-year Westminster tradition that any member of the House, other than ministers, are also able to be afforded questions. That includes government backbench members.
You have more questions than you have backbenchers.
It includes the Green members.
More questions than
I note the
backbenchers.
references to the Senate. Ms O'Connor failed in her own contribution earlier to tell this House that while the Senate may well have speaking limits on answers to question, it has a 1 hour approximately overall time allocation, and there are no minimum questions, I'm advised. There are no guaranteed minimum questions. My point to return is the same as the one I made earlier, which is that if you're concerned about length of time of answers, you might be concerned because you don't get to ask the other questions that you want to ask when there's a 1 hour limit. This is overcome in our House already by a sessional order which has been here each parliament since I've been a member of this House, so that's 3 parliaments, has been a sessional order that guarantees a minimum number of questions. So if you were genuine and if you were concerned that the question time is consumed by a smaller number of long answers, then you may have a case, but this is overcome by the guaranteed minimum number of questions that are provided for, which I humbly say address the concern that you've attempted to make. Now, I also wish to say I agree with Mr O'Byrne's other comment, who has also been a minister. I didn't trouble the Hansard to find them, but there would be certainly times where it's not possible to give a proper answer in 4 minutes, particularly where it might be a detailed question and the minister is in a position to provide detailed answers. For example, some difficult issues that might actually be informed by a strong and robust legal advice, where it's important, and ministers are told, you need to stick to this.
Dick's answers
if you just give me the courtesy
politics at the back end every time.
Making this point.
But it's a dishonest point.
There are circumstances where a minister is not free to roam beyond the advice that's provided to her or him. And it's important to get the message clear on the record, because sometimes there can be ramifications for straying outside of advice that's been provided to you, particularly, for example, where there might be live legal proceedings, just as an example. And there are plenty of opportunities, as I also note, where a minister does need to be able to articulate a policy. Our Attorney-General today took a question which was her opportunity to tell the House and Tasmanians about her law reform in one-punch legislation.
That's right. And 1.5 minutes of that was devoted to attacking the opposition.
Would you note that there was quite a considered expounding of the points of that reform, including the way that it would go to public consultation? I just remember sitting here noting...
into an attack.
I remember sitting here noting that the House really settled down. It was quiet, people were listening, and it was entirely reasonable for the attorney, in the way she conducted herself, to articulate the government's position. And yes, as is always the case, not just with answers, but also with questions, her own opportunity to make a political point which was important to her. Totally reasonable, and has happened for hundreds of years. And I'd be disappointed if you thought that shouldn't ever happen, because this is the Parliament. It's a place for people to speak and be able to get their point of view across. Now, by the way, it is the case that the standing orders already provide the Speaker with the opportunity to ask a minister to resume their seat when enough time has been provided. And Ms O'Connor and I have both made the point. Together we've both made the point that that is an existing provision and it is enforced. It was enforced also today when Mr Shelton was winding up his answer. He was asked to conclude. No doubt others as well. So, look, I know that motions and debates like this one are, I should say, predictably oppositions for opposition or others to make political hit points on the government.
It's not a political hit point.
They're
it's
cheap
just trying
points,
to tighten this
because I think
that
there ought to be, and I would encourage an overriding principle that we ought to have our debates, we ought to vigorously disagree, but there are some things, particularly in the housekeeping of our House, that I do seek to build bridges across the Parliament, because we ought to be able to agree on some of these basics and not for them to be contentious, nor for them to be a springboard to say, yeah, we've got a cultural problem, or your government doesn't respect the standing orders, or the government doesn't respect question time. They are unhelpful, they're cheap points, and I think that it's important that, including on committees of the House, like privileges and conduct, like standing orders, that we ought to be quite collegial within those committees of the House,
Well, you invite
because in
us
fact,
onto the standing orders
because
committee.
in fact they are
Invite
committees
us on.
that take the much longer view. Those committees take a much longer view than a parliamentary term, the period of tenure
They're
of a
stitched up
government,
by the major
or the period
parties,
of
the
tenure of an
parties of
opposition
government,
leader.
who look
They take
after
the
each other
long-term
on
view.
those committees.
And I just make the point. Every one of us actually has a share of responsibility for protecting the reputation of our Parliament to the outside community. Because I put it before you, this is a good Parliament. This is an excellent system of accountability that we have in this state. You may say it has its faults.
I've been sitting here for
you may
11
say it
years
has
and
its
you
weaknesses.
people-
But there are few places in the world
No
that
transparency
I'd
about
rather
you
live.
people.
There's no other place
Of course.
in the world I would rather live. And I think that
We're
it's
devolving
incumbent
now.
on Mr O'Byrne and you, Ms O'Connor, and me, myself, and every member of this House, it's incumbent on us to have our political disagreements, certainly our debates on legislation, but there are some things that we ought to speak well of this House. We ought to speak well of it in the outside community who are listening, and some even at this moment. It is a strong system of accountability that we have. If a minister of a government of any time period in this House is doing the wrong thing, they will be found out. The mechanism is available. And if there's improper behaviour or a mistruth, it can be uncovered in a way that is the envy of the world. Even for members who do not find themselves part of the official opposition. You, Ms O'Connor, you, Dr Woodruff, you are empowered on behalf of your constituency to ask the difficult questions, and you do. I say that as a minister of this government, and long may it be the case. So we don't support the amendment of the Green members. Why? Because the problem that you claim exists is already addressed in the minimum number of questions that is provided for. In this House, you already have 13 questions per day. Under the amendment that I'm seeking to advance, it will be 14 questions every day. And if questions are shorter, there can be more questions. If answers are shorter, then there potentially can be more. And I have seen occasions where as many as 16, 17 questions can be asked.
I've seen occasions where your ministers look at the clock at 1 minute 2 and decide they'll keep talking, so another question can't be asked.
May I suggest that we just get on with it, that we don't agree with the amendment proposed by Ms O'Connor, and that we find a way to move forward with some agreement on ensuring that the new member is able to ask questions without them detracting from the Greens members, which in fact is what this is all about.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. The noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. Now the bells are quiet, huh? Yeah. Right. Are the whips happy? Right, stop the bells, lock the doors. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. The House will divide. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair and the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable member, Dr Woodruff, teller for the ayes. And the honourable member, Ms Dow, is teller for the noes. Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Chair, that's just where I had my dot with my pen as I was counting down, so I've just signed it.
No worries. Thank you. Right. The result of the division is ayes 3, noes 20. The noes therefore have it.